Good morning again.
Morning.
Thank you, sir. So, as Mike mentioned earlier, today we're moving on through the book of James, and we come to what is the smallest section that I think we've preached through in the book of James. It's just one verse. James chapter 5, verse 12. I'll read it, and then would you pray with me? James 5, 12. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes, and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you this morning for the opportunity to proclaim your word, even if it's just one verse today. Help me to do it truthfully and effectively. Father, please use this letter from James this morning to humble us before you. Help us to recognize the areas in our life that perhaps we need to change so that you would be glorified and that our actions reflect those of your Son, Jesus Christ. Help us to love you and to obey you and to display your nature and your character to others in the church and to the community and the world around us for your glory and your honor so that others might worship you. Help me, Lord, to say the things you've called me to say. Keep me from saying anything that is not in line with your word and your will this morning. Amen. Some things are rather fundamental from a social point of view for society to work. Some of these things people kind of debate, and some even deny outright. For example, the role of the family in society. Right now there's a big debate, huge debate about what constitutes a family and what should that be and whether or not you even really need a mother and a father and children for society to work. Scripture says that you need a mother and a father and children, and that really is the cornerstone of all society. But it's very debatable in culture. Many people would deny that. There are other things that everybody would agree with, but not so many people do. For example, honesty and integrity. No society works, and everybody acknowledges this. No society works if when you talk to somebody else, you can never believe what they're saying. You can't function that way. You can't function as a family. You can't function as a business. You can't function in politics. You can't function. It breaks everything. And how do we know that? Look around. Right? And everybody knows this, so everybody claims, right? Whether it be politicians or all these people, oh, I'm speaking the truth, they're liars, but I'm telling the truth, and I'm saying it. Everybody knows that we need to be people who tell the truth. Nobody ever says lying this is a really helpful thing for society. You might get somebody who might say something, yeah, but telling your wife she looks good in that dress, that's good for society, right? You might get one or two people claiming something like that, but outside of that, right? Outside of that, by and large, everybody acknowledges a society has to be honest and truthful. There has to be some kind of trust for society to work. For religion, and families, and businesses, all of these, the reality is they've all broken that trust, and that's what James talks about today in this text. This fundamental aspect. James often has been cueing off of the idea of what we do with our tongues. How do we speak and how do we use our words? And today he talks about that a little bit more when he talks about integrity and truth. And I'll read it again. He says this: above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Now, I'll just spend just a couple of seconds here. He kind of opens this up, and he says, above all, brothers, above all. There's a few different ideas of what people means. Above what? What all is this above? Some people say it's a comparison to the other parts of the book of James where he's talking about speech. This is the most important aspect about speech, and some people talk about it as more like an introduction to the last few verses of the letter. And so he's really saying, above all, and all of these things that follow, I'm not 100% about what exactly is. But what I can say is this. He's emphasizing this point. How exactly it fits in to what he's talking about and the logistical and logical order of things is debated. But what isn't debated is that his point is, pay attention. Pay attention. What I'm about to say is kind of important. Think about this. Do this. However you want to relate it to the rest of the text and around and before, stop and pay attention to this. It matters. It's important. And then he writes this. Do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Now, James is, again, as so many times we've seen through the book of James, James and the Sermon on the Mount are just so tied together. Now, we have to keep this in mind, because in some ways he's not really borrowing from the book of Matthew, because if you guys remember, this was actually the first book of the New Testament that was written. James wrote this before Matthew wrote his gospel. However, James would have had access to knowledge of the Sermon on the Mount from a whole bunch of different people. Perhaps James himself, he was a brother of Jesus. Maybe James was there. He didn't really believe in Jesus at that time. It wasn't until really after the resurrection of Christ that James came to believe in the things that Jesus said about himself. But he may have either heard it in person still, or heard it from all of the other disciples that James would have been interacting with at the time. But either way, James actually wrote this before Matthew. And so Matthew records in more detail of the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus was talking about. But James actually wrote this first, before Matthew wrote his. But he was cueing off of Jesus' statement on the Sermon on the Mount. So I'd like to read that for you too. And one says he's borrowing Jesus' words. Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. This is what Jesus says. Pastor Mike read this a little while ago. He says this, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Now, what James and what Jesus, first Jesus, then James, what they're talking about here is not cussing. When he talks about swearing and oaths, right? He's not talking about cussing and four-letter words. It's not. Now, I'm not saying that it's okay to say those things. We should be careful with those too. But that's not what James is talking about. That's not what Jesus was talking about. What they're talking about here is something that you could almost call a vow, right? An oath to swear. They were used, all of them, to demonstrate the validity of something that you are saying. An oath or a vow or swearing by something is saying something, saying, look, what I'm telling you is true. Let me prove it by swearing an oath on my mother's grave. Or by God in heaven. Or by all the gold in the temple, I swear to you this is true. Right? It's a way to emphasize the truthfulness of what you're saying. That's what he's talking about. This happened in the Old Testament and the New Testament all the time. Here's a couple of examples of this sort of oath-taking or swearing by the object of something else. In 1 Samuel 19:6, we see this. Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and then Saul swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death." Now, I'm not saying Saul was a good guy. That's not the point of writing this. But the point is right, it was common in the Old Testament. That's what Saul did. King Saul. "I swear, as the Lord lives," right? The truthfulness of his promise was evident because he was referencing the living God of the universe. I am invoking God to prove that what I am saying is honest. You swear. That's what's happening here. Again, you see this in the New Testament. Peter does this. And again, not in such a great context. Matthew 26, 73 and 74. We get this picture where Peter is, Jesus is being, he's already been arrested, and Peter is outside waiting for this to happen. And after a little while, these bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then, Peter, he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. So he's swearing, he's making a vow, right? These swearing and oath-taking and vow-taking, they're all the same idea. It's a demonstration of the earnestness and the truthfulness of your statement. That's what James and that's what Jesus were talking about, was these systems that people used to validate their statements, right? That's what he's talking about. Typically, these oaths, especially in the Old and the New Testament and all these places, they would invoke God himself as the witness and judge and arbiter of the oath. More often than not, and there were some times, as we'll see, where they would swear perhaps by the temple or the gold in the temple or something like that. But if you really wanted to make an oath stick, the greater the thing you swore by, the more valid the oath. So the greatest one, and the one that it talks about in the Old and the New Testament, is to swear by God himself. This is the greatest oath that you can take. Because there's no greater object by which you can swear. We see that happen often in the Old Testament. Even for those, we see this is common in our culture today. Right? We do this all the time. We do similar things. Again, I swear on my mother's grave. Why do you pick your mother's grave? Because it's something that's precious to you. Something that means a lot to you. So as a validation of what you're saying, you swear on your mother's grave to prove now what's going to happen to your mother's grave if you break that swear. I don't know. But the point is still there, right? Perhaps some of you in 6th or 5th or 4th grade heard this one. I cross my heart. I hope to die. Stick a needle in my eye. Why needles got involved in this discussion, again, I don't know. But actually, it kind of is not that dissimilar to what's happening even in the oath swearing to God. Stick a needle in my eye. Here's kind of the point. If I don't uphold my vow, you can do something really painful to me. That's really what was even happening in the Old Testament. When you swear by God's name, you're invoking God as arbiter and judge of the commitment that you're making. And the implication is, if you do not uphold this vow, I am submitting myself to the judgment of God. It's significant. I would rather probably have a needle stuck in my eye than to be under God's wrath. Some people like to swear by their pinky. Why that happened and how we got there, I don't know. Right? But you pinky promise. So somehow the interlocking of two pinkies seals the deal. Right? This happens in our culture all the time. You see it amongst children all the time. Right? If you're in Middle Earth, you might swear by the precious, for those of you guys who know Lord of the Rings. Why? Why would you swear by the precious? Again, because it is the most important thing. If you get the reference in that movie, this thing was the most important object to this creature, and so that was the thing he swore by, because there was nothing more important and valuable to him. And this is the idea of the oath. The more important and valuable the thing that you swear by, the more significant the oath. That's the deal. Now, many of these, obviously, we don't take so seriously. Hopefully, if any of you pinkies swear, that may or may not bind you contractually to the selling and leasing of properties or the purchasing of vehicles or things like that. I don't think most people accept pinky swears as binding. So none of these are obviously serious. But when it came to God, it was very serious. Right? We kind of use some of these things jokingly now, but in the Old Testament, and I think this is a good thing, and I don't think we do this as much as we ought to. They are invoking the living God. Now, if you walk through life going like, yeah, there's sort of a God out there, and I think that He exists. What application does that have to me every day? Not really any, other than I know He's sort of there. That is not the worldview. It shouldn't be our worldview. And it was definitely not the worldview when we're talking about taking these oaths in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you invoke the name of God, you earnestly believe, and we still should, earnestly believe that God is in heaven, and when you make an oath to Him, He takes it seriously, and there will be consequences. You better maintain that oath, because God is real on His throne in heaven. And if you swear by His name, you better uphold it. Because God does not take this lightly. That would be like going in front of the executioner, right? But far greater and saying, I will allow this executioner to kill me if I do not hold this oath. All of a sudden it gets real serious. Right? That's what it was for them to take an oath before the living God. It was real serious. They took Him as seriously as any executioner. And so should we. I think that's a loss for us, not a gain. During this time, taking an oath by something meant something significant. It was not just words. It shouldn't have been just words. But you see this throughout all of the history of the Old Testament. We're going to throw up a whole bunch of verses here and keep your fingers nimble and all of that stuff. Because I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour through the Old Testament about how we get from these oaths of the Old Testament to now James going through and saying, stop taking oaths. Knock it off. And we'll walk through a little bit because it's important to see why we get to where James is at. So let's back up a little bit. In the Old Testament, oaths were not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, so much on the other side, there are places in the Old Testament where God Himself says, take an oath by my name. It is an instruction given to do this. For example, and I think this is up on the screen, Exodus chapter 22, verses 10 through 11. If a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep safe, and it dies or is injured or is driven away without anyone seeing it, an oath by the Lord shall be between them both, to see whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. The owner shall accept the oath, and he shall not make restitution. So here's the idea, right? You've got this debate between two people about this property. This is a very legal situation. You've got this debate between these two people about the property. Both people say, look, I didn't do anything. I promise you, right? I didn't do anything. And the other guy says, well, I sure didn't do anything. So here's the situation. And what God tells them to do, swear an oath by the Lord. Swear to God that you did not touch your neighbor's property. You swear by God, and you swear by God. There was something in the Old Testament that made this so significant that if one was willing to swear by the name of Yahweh, by the God of the universe, the creator of heaven and earth, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, you swear by this God's name. And that is so binding and so meaningful and such a proof, nobody owes anybody money. You swear by that name that you didn't do this, we take it as good. You don't owe anything. This is a big deal. This is really important. Really important. Again, in Numbers 30, verses 3 through 5, and this one's a little bit different, but it talks about, and in this whole section, if you ever wanted to look at it, the big section in Numbers talks about swearing oaths and vows and things like that. And I'm just going to read one little piece of it for an idea of what's going on. If a woman vows a vow to the Lord and binds herself by a pledge, while within her father's house in her youth, and her father hears of her vow and of her pledge, by which she has bound herself, and says nothing to her, then all her vows shall stand. And every pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father opposes her on the day that he hears of it, no vow of hers, no pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her because her father opposed her. So the point of this, there's a lot of interesting things going on here, but the point of this is not about who gets to vow and when he gets to vow. The point of this is it's an assumed piece of the culture that if somebody makes a vow, and it talks about other vows in this section too, but the basic idea is that if somebody makes a vow, they're bound to it. And specifically, it talks about making a vow to the Lord. You pledge to the Lord that you're going to get 2 calves and as honor to Him. You are bound to this. You better uphold your vow. This is not a light thing. This is not a, I think I'll do this. Do it. If you don't, you might find yourself under condemnation. This is a serious thing to make a vow. And the Old Testament promotes this idea of taking vows. The very thing that James is saying, stop doing this. The Old Testament is promoted. And we're going to get to what makes that shift happen. As a matter of fact, we see even in the Old Testament that God Himself makes vows and upholds them by His own name. Numbers 14:21 through 23. But truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled. And notice, as I live. This is the part with the vow. Just as I live, which is an absolute truth. Truly, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the days of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. That was again, He swore to give something to their fathers. And none of those who despise me shall see it. Right? So God is swearing on His own account. I promise you, as I live, this is never going to happen. He's making an oath based on Himself, because there's nothing greater to base it on. So we see God making oaths. Again, Deuteronomy 4:31. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers. That He swore to them. God swore to uphold this thing. Deuteronomy 7:8. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that He swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out of with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Old Testament people are called to make oaths. God made oaths in the Old Testament. They all swore to things, and they swore on God's name to things. This is not something that is morally reprehensible in the Old Testament. It's commanded, it's demanded, and it's expected in the Old Testament. God Himself swears and makes oaths. Oath and swearing and vowing isn't the problem. That's not the root of the problem for James or for Jesus. That wasn't the root of the situation. As a matter of fact, it actually brings glory to God to say that I'm going to swear by the greatest thing that I know, and so I swear by the name of my God. That is setting God up as the most magnificent. It's honoring God as there being nothing else greater than Him. So in some sense, to swear by the name of God is to say there is none greater than God to swear by. It actually glorifies Him in that sense. If that's how you mean it. If that's how you mean it. The difficulty is this. People, us, unlike God, really mess stuff up. We can do that. I don't know if you've ever noticed that or seen that in any areas around your life, but people can have a real ability to really mess stuff up. So, God knew this from the very beginning. And so God puts parameters on these oaths, and He warns about the taking of these oaths. Right? So we'll see here again in the Old Testament, as God is saying, take these oaths, do these oaths, and God's making oaths. He also gives parameters and warnings, because He knows the heart of man. He gives warnings about these oaths. Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Do not minimize the name of God. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes His name in vain. You make little of your God, you cannot be considered guiltless. God is significant. Leviticus 19:11 through 12. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. And here, most importantly, in 12, you shall not swear by my name. But it doesn't stop there. It says falsely. You can swear by his name, but you better not do it falsely. If you're going to swear by the name of God, you better be telling the truth. You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. There is massive weight and warning that God gives the people of the Old Testament. Swear by my name, fine. Glorify me and using me as a demonstration of your integrity, fine. But you better have integrity when you do it. Or else, I am the Lord, and I am the judge. And there is a penalty if one falsely swears by my name. Zechariah 8:17. Do not devise evil in your hearts against one another, and love no false oath. For all these things I hate, declares the Lord. So throughout the Old Testament, vows on God's name and swearing oaths in general, they weren't prohibited. But there was a dire warning about their usage. Matter of fact, in some sense, they were encouraged, but that you were warned about these things. And people messed it up. We got it all wonky. And so we get to this point, right? In the intertestamental period, we see the Old Testament, these things are being used. And then what happens, and the reason we get to Matthew saying, recording what Jesus says, and the reason we get to James saying what James says is this. By the time we get around to the New Testament, right? If you guys remember, all of Israel had fallen, and there's this long time in between. They're coming back in the nation, and you get to the religious leaders of during Jesus' time, the modern state of Israel. They're all very, very concerned, hyper-concerned, overly concerned, and legalistic about how to follow every rule, and all of a sudden everything becomes this legal debate, right? So what they start doing is instead of holding to simply the specific integrity of the statement that's made and swearing in God's name, they turn it into legalese. They start doing the lawyer thing, right? They begin to mess around with how to use the terminology, and they say, okay, all right, so what God is saying is that if you swear by the name of God, well, that's a really big deal. But what if you just swear by the temple of God? Right? Now that's not swearing by God, so we got some wiggle room here that's different, right? And they start dividing these things up, and they start making these rules based on how you do things. So by the time you get to Jesus, as they're nitpicking and messing with this, eventually, it came to this point, right? And all of these Old Testament historians and things like that record this, that if one were to swear by Jerusalem, it's not binding. But if you swear toward Jerusalem, that's legally binding, right? If you swear by the temple, that doesn't actually bind you legally. But if you swear by the gold of the temple, you're committed. Right? This is what we're doing now. This is how they're beginning to analyze all of these Old Testament things about swearing to God. They turn it into this legal chaos. If you swear by the altar, not legally binding, you got some room there. You didn't really commit yourself. But if you swear by the sacrifice that was on the altar, you're bound. You got to uphold it. That's what the Jews were doing. So by the time we get to Jesus and by the time we get to James, all of these oaths that have the significant thing that was fundamentally placed on the character and nature of God, that God is holy beyond all things, and that if you swear by the name of God, it doesn't matter what you do, you uphold that. For God's glory and for His honor and for your safety. You better uphold this. But the Jews began to take this and they turned it into this crazy legal mess, right? I think we've all seen this stuff happen, right? Okay, well, we go through, we look at our contract. Hey, the guy forgot to sign his middle name. Contract void. Baloney. Everybody knows that these two people signed this contract. That's an excuse. You signed that, he signed that, everybody knows you signed that. Integrity dictates you uphold that contract. But how many times do you see in our culture people finding loopholes? All these ways to manipulate contracts and all of these ways to say, well, I said this, but it didn't really count because I did this and it didn't really mean it, so I don't really have to do that. Right? This is super common still. We do this all the time. That's what the leaders in Israel, that's what the religious leaders were doing. They were taking this thing that God said, which was basically, if you swear by my name, this is significant and it means something, and they turned it into legalese. And they began to manipulate it and downplay it, and all of a sudden, it didn't really matter anymore, because it was just a game. It was just some legal game, some contract game, and it was no longer about the holiness and the importance of the God by whom you were swearing and the integrity of the thing you were swearing. It wasn't about that anymore. Now it was about the contract. Now it was about whether or not you dotted your I's and crossed your T's, and did you write it in the right format, and did you have the right 3 people sign it or not? Right? It became about the contract, and it was a way for these religious leaders, as James has been talking about over and over and over in this book, right? Hey, just be what you say you're going to be. You call yourself a Christian, then your tongue better look like it. Don't be just a hearer of the word, be a doer of the word. So these people in Jerusalem who were making all these absurd laws, they heard the word and they should have known better, but they weren't actually doing it. They were figuring out ways to justify themselves, to go outside of what God had commanded for their own profit, for their own benefit. Well, and we heard even just a couple weeks ago about these men, these rich men who were landowners who were withholding the finances, right, that they were supposed to give these wages. I can't help but feel, and it doesn't specifically explicitly say this, but you get this kind of idea like, well, I promised them those wages, but look, contractually speaking, they didn't sign the name right. Like, hey, I swore by the temple's gold instead of the temple, and so I wasn't really obligated. You know, I don't really have to pay them because I swore by the temple instead of the temple's gold. So, sorry, dude, contract void. See ya. Right? This is the idea that you get, that these leaders are claiming religiosity. They're claiming their holiness, but it's all a fraud. It's a bunch of baloney. It's a bunch of excuses bound up in Christianese to allow them to manipulate the people around them for their own benefit. That's what's happening here. And so we get to Jesus. So we get, well, I'll go back again. This is actually the verse that Jesus quotes in Matthew. It's Leviticus 19:12. You remember, it says again, I read this earlier, you shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your Lord, the Lord your God. I am the Lord. Right? We get from there, and we scoot down to now Matthew records Jesus saying in 5:33-37, I'm going to read this again. Right? With all of that context, I'm going to read this again. Again, you have heard it said to those of old, and then he kind of roughly quotes this verse that I just read. You shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all. Either by heaven, why? Because it's the throne of God. Your little legalese is baloney. You can call it heaven if you want, but ultimately you're swearing by God. It's his throne. Or by earth, for it's God's footstool. You want to swear by earth instead of heaven? And all your little legalese as if it's an excuse to get out? It's not. Baloney. That's God's footstool. You swear by earth, you're swearing by God. You swear by heaven, you're swearing by God. All of these silly excuses that you're making, hogwash. Baloney. This is this silly legalese, and I don't accept it. Or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no, and anything that comes from evil. He's not talking about the oath itself being evil. He's talking about all of these crazy machinations that these guys, this legalese that all of these leaders have been using to excuse themselves from maintaining the oaths that they promised. Anything that is an excuse for you to try and justify getting out of the word that you made is baloney. It's evil. It's simply you trying to take advantage of the people around you. It's evil. That's what he's saying. The idea is we have to get back to the very nature of God and the truth. You swear something, it should be true. Period. I don't care what you swear by. It doesn't matter on what thing you place an oath. All oaths, especially for the believer, are placed on God. As a matter of fact, every word that we speak ought to be an oath placed on the Word of God, on God Himself. We are expected to have integrity. So James again repeats Jesus' words. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath. Just let your yes be yes, and your no be no, that you may not fall into condemnation. Be a doer of the word, not just a hearer only, deceiving yourselves, right? Thinking like I'm okay religiously because I'm using the religious terminology. You're lying to yourself. If you're figuring out ways to get out of the things that you told people, you're lying to yourself. You're not really walking with Christ. If you're not upholding your vows and staying true to your word, if a handshake is not enough, you're not really walking with Jesus. You're a liar. That's what's going on here. And I think if we were to say, are any of us here guilty of this and liars? Right? Every single hand in this room should go up. Thank goodness for the grace of Jesus Christ. But we strive for this kind of integrity. And that's what James is saying, and that's what Jesus was saying is, forget all of the legalese. Just, if you say you're going to do it, do it. You shouldn't need any more than that. Your kids shouldn't have to make you promise something. Right? If you're home with your kids, you say, I'm going to do this. For you to promise that you're going to do it shouldn't mean anything, because every time that you say this is what I'm going to do, it should be as good as a promise. We're all guilty of that. I'm guilty of that too. You can ask all of my kids, right? But for the believer, that's what it must look like. That's what it is to follow Christ. Is that when you say, yes, I'll do that, that's as good as swearing an oath and signing any contract. Should be for the believer. And if you say, no, that didn't happen, that should be as good as every video surveillance camera footage and every signed contract and no matter how many notary republics you've had to defend your position. Should be enough for you to say it didn't happen. That should be the level of integrity of the believer who follows Christ. It should be what it is. Why? Because that is the very nature and character of God whom we follow. Numbers 23:19. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Psalm 119:160. The sum of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous rules endure forever. John 14:6, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. As a matter of fact, the very foundation of our salvation and our hope itself is based on the integrity and the oaths and the truthfulness and the validity of God. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 18. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he granted it with an oath. So that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled from refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the purpose he set before us. Here's the point. When God speaks, when he makes an oath, it is absolute and it is binding. It is impossible. God doesn't need to make an oath. He did that for our benefit. God says, and it is. Period. He cannot lie. There is no realm in which God can ever say something that is not perfectly and completely true. And as we go through our life, as we're the disciples of Christ, who is the perfect image of the Father, our lives must begin to reflect more and more and more the life of Christ, which is simply this. When we say it, it should be true. Period. You don't need an oath. You don't need all these others. You don't need to swear. Ideally, honestly, amongst Christians, I know this will never happen, but what it should be is that everybody in this room could sell and buy houses to each other and sell and buy cars and be in business contracts. It should be that we can do all of those things and never have to sign our name on a piece of paper. That's what it should be. It won't be. It's not going to happen. But as believers in Jesus Christ, whose integrity is to such a degree that it ought to be, that should be what we would be able to do. We should be able to be so confident in the integrity of each other that we simply say, hey, you agree? You want to buy this car for $1,500? Give me the money in 30 days. Shake hands on it, and that's enough. It should be enough. If we're truly submitting to God and truly upholding the purposes that He's saying here, your yes is yes, and it's an absolute binding thing. And your no is no, and it's an absolute binding thing. And that should be enough. You shouldn't even have to take it up. You shouldn't even have to promise. You shouldn't have to swear. You shouldn't have to write a contract. You shouldn't have to do that. Now, let me explain this too. What James is saying, and what Matthew is recording of Jesus' words, does not mean that you cannot have a contract. Please don't misunderstand. It doesn't mean that when you're testifying in a court of law that you can't stick your hand on the Bible and say, right, all the things that it's anything right? But you swear to tell, there we go. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? That's what I'm pretty sure it says when you're watching that walk and all that. Right? It's not wrong to do that. His point is not to say you can never put your hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth. You should. You just shouldn't need to. It's not that you can't, but you shouldn't have to. Right? You certainly shouldn't have to when we're talking to each other. Certainly as we talk to our brothers and sisters, we should have the absolute confidence of saying, you don't need to put your hand on the Bible. You don't need to swear on your mother's grave. You don't need to involve pinkies or needles. None of that stuff should be necessary. If you say it's true, I believe it's true because I believe in your character. Because your character is that of Jesus Christ. That's what it should be for us. As we seek to represent and to glorify our King and our God, that's all we should need. And the warning from this is similar to the warnings in the Old Testament and the warnings so often given here in the book of James. If you don't do this, if you try to swear because you're using manipulations and you're trying to make this situation where you can discuss the legalese and figure out a loophole that you can get out of later, if that's the kind of game you're playing, you be careful, because you might be a man who's going to fall into condemnation. And that condemnation is not simply because you just lied this one time. The whole point is, your life isn't really pursuing Christ. If your goal is to figure out ways to lie and steal and cheat contracts, you're not really loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's not what you care about. What you're really looking for is to get your own, is to get yours. And to get it from whomever you're trying to get it. Your goal is not Christ. Your goal is not the glory of the Father. Your goal is not putting treasure in heaven. Your goal is to manipulate the people around you to get your goal here. You're interested in the things of the world, not the things of God. So if you've got to set up these big oath schemes and promises and all of this stuff, you better be careful. Because if that's what you're doing, you may fall into the condemnation. We cannot be like that. The world is like that. It's obvious that the world is like that. Watch any media, watch anything on social media, watch the politicians, watch the business in it. It's easy to see, right? They all promise all kinds of stuff, and most of the time, we all know. It's so sad because we sit back, and I'm sure no matter which side of the aisle in politics you're on, we can all sit back and say, yeah, I really don't trust any of them. We know that all of them, pretty much all of them, are going to get up there and they're doing what they need to do to get into office, and they're probably not going to keep most of the stuff they're going to say. We know that. That's just part of the game. May it never be in our church. May it never be. Our church should be a bastion of glorious truth and integrity in comparison to the rest of the world. When people come in here, they should be able to say, that can't work. And how often I've even heard inside of the church, that can't work. But in the church, it should. Because people will come and say, yeah, but you can't do things like that. You can't actually make agreements like that and not have contracts. You can't do that. It's going to bite you. It's going to come back. It's going to get you. Well, yeah, maybe it will. And some of the people in our church might not be holding up to their vows. That could be. But we should be so different that we would be willing to go into these contracts based on somebody's word. Because that's what the church is. And then when people come outside and they say, that can't possibly work, and then they see us and they see how we operate, and they go, oh my goodness, it worked. These believers are actually, they don't need the legal system to enforce their integrity. They don't need laws and judges and rules to make sure that they do what they say they're going to do. It should blow their minds. And they should come in here and they should see this and they should say, as we are displaying the glory of God before them in our integrity and in our truthfulness, they ideally would say, where is this coming from and how can I be part of that? Now we're all sinners, even in the church, in need of redemption, and we won't do this perfectly. And I'm not demanding that no contracts get signed between people. Please don't misunderstand that. I'm not saying you should never sign a contract or that you can never take a vow or that you shouldn't use legal documents. I'm not saying that. My point is this. We should be so radically different from the rest of the world that it should be evident when people walk in here and see how we interact with each other. That could look a bunch of different ways. I'm not being legalistic about which papers you sign and which things you handshake on. I'm not doing that. But it should be different. The glory of God should be displayed absolutely through the integrity and the truthfulness of His people. And if His people don't care, then be careful because you might not really be His people. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you for your grace and your mercy and your integrity. And it is based on your integrity and that hope that we have life and salvation and everything. You made a promise from the very beginning of Genesis 3 that Eve's offspring would crush the head of the enemy. And you kept that promise through all of these years, thousands of years, and we have hope and life because of it, and we thank you for that. Lord, help us to represent you well. Please, Father, all of us can easily look at a time where we could be convicted of this. Please help us to be willing to look in that mirror of Scripture and stand corrected. That our integrity might increase so that your glory and the worship of you and others might increase. That others might see you through us as we represent you, as we are your ambassadors of reconciliation. Lord, help us to live in such a way that people see your glory in our lives. Thank you, Lord, that that's possible through the work of your Holy Spirit. Amen.